There was a time when making you feel guilty was enough. Someone could say, "After everything I've done for you," and you would immediately start questioning yourself. Someone could become distant, and you would chase them. Someone could accuse you of being selfish, and you would start explaining yourself. Someone could withdraw their approval, and suddenly you felt responsible for fixing the relationship. Guilt worked because you cared. It worked because you had a conscience. It worked because somewhere inside you believed that being a good person meant keeping everyone comfortable, even when their comfort came at the expense of your own peace. But something has changed. The loner learned the pattern. The person who used to over-explain now stays silent. The person who used to chase now watches. The person who used to apologize for having boundaries now simply keeps them. And this is where the old tactics stop working. Because once guilt stops controlling you, people who depended on your guilt have to find something else. Carl Jung spent his life studying the hidden forces that shape human behavior, while Nietzsche repeatedly challenged the moral systems people use to control themselves and each other. Neither man was writing specifically about modern loners in the way we use the word today, but their ideas give us a powerful lens for understanding what happens when a person becomes psychologically independent. The important thing isn't that everyone around you is secretly manipulating you. They aren't. The important thing is learning to recognize when pressure is being disguised as morality, when control is disguised as concern, and when someone is trying to make you feel guilty simply because they can no longer control you through approval. And once you see that pattern, something changes. They change tactics, but you change too. The old method was simple. Make the loner feel guilty for choosing themselves. Tell them they're selfish. Tell them they've changed. Tell them they don't care anymore. Remind them of everything you've supposedly done for them. Make them feel indebted. Make them question whether their boundaries are cruel. And if they start pulling away, make the withdrawal emotionally expensive. The goal isn't always to convince you that they're right. Sometimes the goal is simply to make you uncomfortable enough that you return to the old role. Because the moment you stop doing what someone expects, the relationship has to reveal what it was built on. If it was built on genuine respect, the relationship adapts. If it was built on your compliance, the other person experiences your independence as betrayal. This is why a loner can suddenly become the problem the moment they stop being convenient. You didn't necessarily become colder, you became less available for emotional control. And here's the first tactic they use now, making your boundaries sound like a character flaw. You say, "I don't want to do that," and suddenly you're selfish. You say, "I need some time alone," and suddenly you're antisocial. You say, "I'm not comfortable discussing that," and suddenly you're secretive. You stop answering every call and you're accused of not caring. You stop explaining every decision and you're called arrogant. Notice what happened. Nobody actually addressed your boundary. They attacked the person who created it. That's an important distinction. Healthy people may disagree with your boundary, but they can still respect it. Manipulative pressure often tries to make you ashamed of having one. And if you've spent years believing that being good means being endlessly available, that tactic can work. You start thinking, maybe they're right. Maybe I'm becoming selfish. But ask yourself something simpler. Would I call another person selfish for protecting the same boundary I'm trying to protect? If the answer is no, then maybe you're not dealing with morality. Maybe you're dealing with conditioning. Nietzsche understood that morality can become complicated when moral language is used to disguise power. He was deeply suspicious of values that demanded obedience while pretending to be purely virtuous. And this doesn't mean morality itself is manipulation. It means you should pay attention when words like good, bad, selfish, loyal, and caring suddenly appear whenever someone wants you to surrender your autonomy. The question isn't, is this person calling me selfish? The question is, why do they need me to feel selfish for saying no? That question changes the entire conversation. The second tactic is more subtle. They make you question your perception. You notice a pattern, and instead of discussing the pattern, they make you doubt whether it happened. You say, "That hurt me," and suddenly you're too sensitive. You mention something they promised, and they tell you you're remembering it wrong. You point out repeated behavior, and they accuse you of overthinking. You notice that they treat you differently around certain people, and suddenly you're paranoid. This is where a psychologically independent person becomes dangerous to manipulation. Not because they are aggressive, but because they start trusting their own observations. They don't automatically assume their perception is perfect. They question themselves. But they also don't automatically surrender their perception simply because someone disagrees. That's the difference between self-reflection and self-doubt. The third tactic is withdrawal of approval. This is especially effective against people who are trained to seek validation. You disagree and suddenly the warmth disappears. You establish a boundary and the person becomes cold. You stop behaving the way they prefer and they become distant. The silent message is simple. Return to the old version of yourself and you'll get affection again. If you don't recognize what's happening, you'll start chasing the approval. You'll apologize just to restore peace. You'll compromise just to feel accepted. But the loner who has spent enough time alone eventually discovers something terrifying to people who rely on approval. Silence doesn't scare them anymore. They can survive someone being disappointed. They can survive being misunderstood. They can survive not being invited. They can survive someone deciding they no longer like them. Once you learn that, approval loses its power. This is where solitude becomes psychological armor. Not because being alone automatically makes you strong, but because solitude gives you the opportunity to discover that your emotional survival doesn't depend on constant external reassurance. You sit alone long enough, and eventually you realize that nobody is coming to regulate every uncomfortable feeling for you. You have to do it yourself. You have to sit with uncertainty. You have to experience rejection without immediately chasing the person who rejected you. You have to feel lonely without calling someone who repeatedly damages your peace. And eventually you realize something important. An uncomfortable feeling is not an emergency. Someone being disappointed in you is not an emergency. Someone misunderstanding you is not an emergency. Someone leaving is not automatically an emergency. That realization destroys an enormous amount of psychological leverage. And then comes the fourth tactic, making you afraid of becoming alone. This is perhaps the oldest weapon of all. Nobody else will understand you. You'll regret leaving. Who else do you have? You'll end up alone. These statements sound like concern, but sometimes they're really predictions designed to activate your deepest fear. If someone knows you are afraid of loneliness, they don't need to prove that the relationship is healthy. They only need to convince you that leaving will be worse. But here's the problem with that tactic. Once you become comfortable with solitude, the threat loses its power. You realize that being alone for a season is not the same as being abandoned forever. You realize that temporary loneliness is often healthier than permanent self-betrayal, and you begin asking a question that changes everything. Am I staying because this relationship is good or because I'm afraid of what happens if I leave? That question exposes a lot, because some relationships survive not through love, but through fear. Fear of being alone, fear of starting over, fear of disappointing family, fear of looking unsuccessful, fear of admitting that you were wrong, fear of losing status, fear of having to explain your decision. And when fear becomes the glue holding a relationship together, people can mistake endurance for loyalty. The fifth tactic is weaponizing your empathy. This one is especially effective against people who genuinely care. They know you'll understand. They know you'll give another chance. They know you'll listen to their explanation. They know you'll think about their childhood, their trauma, their stress, their problems, their reasons. And empathy is beautiful until someone learns that your ability to understand them can be used to excuse everything they do. You become so good at understanding why someone behaves badly that you stop asking whether their behavior is acceptable. You become their psychologist, their rescuer, their emotional safety net, and slowly your own needs disappear. Carl Jung's work on the shadow becomes relevant here. The compassionate person can have a shadow containing anger, aggression, selfishness, and the ability to say enough. If you've spent your life identifying as the good person, you may suppress these qualities because you believe they make you bad. But Jung's point was not that you should become cruel. It was that rejected parts of yourself still exist. When you refuse to acknowledge them consciously, they can control you unconsciously. Your anger might explode after years of suppression. Your resentment might poison relationships. Or your shadow may finally teach you the boundary you were afraid to establish. The healthy integration isn't becoming selfish. It's realizing that self-protection is not evil. This is why the person who has integrated their shadow becomes harder to manipulate. They know they are capable of saying no. They know they can walk away. They know they can disappoint someone and survive it. They don't need to pretend to be endlessly agreeable because they are no longer terrified of their own anger. They can acknowledge, yes, I'm angry, and then choose what to do with that anger. They can say, I care about you, but this behavior is unacceptable. They can love someone without rescuing them from consequences. The sixth tactic is turning your past against your present. Someone reminds you of everything you used to do. You weren't like this before. You used to call every day. You used to come whenever I needed you. You used to tell me everything. And maybe that's true, but here's what they don't say. You used to have different boundaries. People sometimes become emotionally attached to an older version of you because that version was easier for them to access. They don't necessarily miss you, they miss what you provided. They miss your availability, your attention, your emotional labor, your willingness to fix things, your inability to say no. And when you change, they experience the loss of those benefits as a loss of you. But growth is allowed to change the terms of your relationships. You are not legally obligated to remain the same person forever, just because someone became comfortable with your old identity. The seventh tactic is manufactured urgency. We need to talk right now. If you really cared, you'd answer. If you're loyal, prove it. Make a decision now. Urgency is powerful because it prevents reflection. And reflection is exactly what manipulative pressure doesn't want. A person who thinks slowly is harder to rush into something. A loner who has learned to sit with uncertainty may simply say, "I'll think about it." That sentence can be incredibly powerful. You don't have to answer immediately. You don't have to defend yourself immediately. You don't have to make permanent decisions in temporary emotional situations. Give yourself time. Time reveals patterns. Time reveals motives. Time allows emotions to settle, so you can see what remains after the emotional pressure disappears. The eighth tactic is playing the victim when you establish a boundary. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what happened. It's about how hurt they are by your response to what happened. You say, "You can't speak to me like that," and they respond, "I can't believe you would treat me this way." You say, "I need space," and they say, "You're abandoning me." You say, "That behavior isn't acceptable," and they respond with their own pain. Now you're comforting them for the boundary you just had to establish. And if you're naturally empathetic, you can get trapped here for hours. This is where you need to learn a simple psychological distinction. Someone can be genuinely hurt by your boundary without your boundary being wrong. Their feelings are real, but their feelings do not automatically determine your responsibility. You can understand someone's pain without surrendering your decision. You can say, "I understand that this hurts you," without saying, "Therefore I will remove my boundary." That's emotional adulthood, and perhaps the most sophisticated tactic is making independence look like loneliness. They tell you that you're isolating yourself. Maybe sometimes you are. It's worth honestly examining. But there is a difference between unhealthy isolation and intentional solitude. Isolation says, "Nobody can be trusted." Solitude says, "I want to hear myself think." Isolation comes from fear. Solitude can come from clarity. The goal isn't to become a person who needs nobody. The goal is to become a person who doesn't abandon themselves just to avoid being alone. Nietzsche's philosophy repeatedly challenged the comfort of the herd, the pressure to conform, to adopt values simply because everyone else does, to avoid standing apart. And that idea connects powerfully with the modern loner. The moment you stop needing the crowd to approve of your choices, you become harder to direct. You can disagree without needing to attack. You can stand alone without needing everyone to join you. You can say, "This is not for me," without needing 100 people to validate the decision. And that's when people may start saying, "You've changed." Of course you've changed. That's what growth does. The problem isn't change. The problem is changing unconsciously to satisfy everyone else. Real individuation means becoming more conscious of what belongs to you and what was handed to you by your environment. You begin asking, "Do I actually believe this? Do I actually want this? Do I actually owe this person what they are demanding? Am I helping because I choose to, or because I'm afraid of being called selfish?" These questions make you difficult to control because they interrupt automatic obedience. And here's the final tactic. They try to make you feel guilty for becoming difficult to manipulate. They may not say it directly. They may simply become uncomfortable with your calmness. You don't react the way you used to. You don't argue for hours. You don't chase. You don't defend yourself. You don't explode. You just make a decision and live with it. That can be deeply unsettling to someone who learned how to control you through emotional reactions. But don't confuse calmness with cruelty. You don't need to become ruthless. You don't need to expose everyone. You don't need to become a master manipulator because someone manipulated you. You don't need revenge, you need awareness. That's the real transformation. The old version of you asked, "How do I make them understand?" The new version asks, "What did their behavior teach me?" The old version asked, "How do I make them stay?" The new version asks, "Is this relationship healthy enough to keep?" The old version asked, "What will they think of me?" The new version asks, "What do I think of myself when I tolerate this?" That's the moment the tactics stop working, because guilt only works when you believe someone else's disappointment is proof that you've done something wrong. Fear only works when you believe being alone is worse than losing yourself. Approval only works when you believe other people's opinions determine your worth. Urgency only works when you believe you cannot take time to think. Manipulation only works when you don't trust your own perception. And emotional pressure becomes weaker when you can sit quietly and say, I understand what you're trying to make me feel, but I don't have to obey it. That is psychological independence, so if you've noticed that certain people behave differently now that you have boundaries, don't immediately assume you've become cold. Examine the relationship. Ask whether they respected you when you had no boundaries. Ask whether they supported your independence. Ask whether they could accept no. Ask whether their affection depended on your compliance. Ask whether they miss you, or simply miss the version of you they could control. And be honest with yourself, because not every uncomfortable reaction is manipulation. Sometimes people genuinely feel hurt. Sometimes you genuinely make mistakes. Sometimes your boundaries need communication. Sometimes solitude becomes avoidance. Sometimes independence becomes arrogance. The goal isn't to label everyone toxic. The goal is to become conscious enough to tell the difference. That's what makes this journey difficult. You aren't trying to become someone who trusts nobody. You're becoming someone who trusts themselves. You aren't trying to stop caring. You're learning where your care belongs. You aren't trying to become emotionless. You're learning that emotions can inform you without controlling you. You aren't trying to defeat other people. You're trying to stop being defeated by your own unconscious patterns. And maybe that's the real meaning behind the words, they changed tactics. They changed tactics because the old version of you stopped responding. The guilt doesn't work anymore. The silent treatment doesn't work anymore. The accusations don't work anymore. The pressure doesn't work anymore. The fear of being alone doesn't work anymore. The need for approval doesn't work anymore. Not because you became heartless, because you finally became conscious. And consciousness is difficult to manipulate. If you've reached this point in your life, don't announce your transformation. You don't need to tell everyone that you're different. Just live differently. Take your time. Watch patterns. Protect your attention. Choose your relationships carefully. Let people earn deeper access to you through consistency rather than demanding it through emotional pressure. And when someone tries to make you feel guilty for choosing your own peace, pause before you respond. Ask yourself one question. Would I still make this choice if I knew they couldn't punish me for it? If the answer is yes, pay attention. That may be your real answer. Because the goal was never to become untouchable. The goal was to become internally free. And once you become internally free, people can still criticize you. They can misunderstand you. They can dislike you. They can leave. They can disagree. They can try to pressure you, but they cannot easily make you betray yourself. That is the power of the loner who finally understands their own mind. They don't need to control the room. They don't need to win every argument. They don't need to expose every manipulator. They simply stop participating in games that require them to abandon themselves. And when that happens, the world may say you've become difficult. Maybe you have. Difficult to guilt, difficult to rush, difficult to shame, difficult to control, difficult to manipulate. And for the right people, you won't be difficult at all. You'll be clear. You'll be honest. You'll be peaceful. You'll be someone whose yes actually means yes because your no is allowed to exist. That's not loneliness, that's sovereignty. And if you've ever been made to feel guilty for needing distance, for protecting your peace, for refusing to explain yourself endlessly, or for becoming less available to people who only valued what you gave them, remember this. You don't have to become cruel to become free. You don't have to stop loving people to stop obeying their emotional demands. You don't have to destroy the bridge. Sometimes you simply stop crossing it. And when the old tactics stop working, you don't need a new weapon. You need a stronger relationship with yourself. Because the moment you stop allowing guilt to make your decisions, something inside you becomes quiet. You hear your own judgment. You recognize your own values. You trust your own perception. And for the first time, you realize that maybe the greatest thing you ever learned was not how to control other people. It was how to stop letting other people control you.